The dust clouds, kicked up by Clara's mare, settled slowly in the late afternoon heat of Dry Creek, Texas. She dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent more time in saddles than parlors, her worn leather boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. The town stretched before her like a faded photograph, weathered wooden buildings leaning against each other for support, their paint long since surrendered to the relentless sun and wind. Clara adjusted her father's old hat, pulling the brim low over her eyes. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting even, like carrying a piece of him with her. She'd inherited more than just his hat. She had his stubborn streak, his keen eye for value, and most importantly, his unfinished business in this God-forsaken town. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gravelly voice from the saloon's covered porch. "Look what the wind blew in." 3 men sat tilted back in wooden chairs, their boots propped up on the railing, bottles of beer sweating in the heat beside them. The speaker, a heavy-set man with greying whiskers, squinted at Clara with undisguised amusement. "Ain't that something, boys?" "A lady come to town on auction day," chuckled the second man, younger but no less weathered, his shirt stained with sweat and yesterday's dinner. Clara tied her horse to the hitching post, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She could feel their eyes on her, cataloguing every detail, the mended patches on her riding skirt, the dust on her boots, the way she carried herself like she belonged here, even though they'd never seen her before. "You lost, miss?" called the third man, this one thin as a rail with tobacco-stained teeth. "Nearest church social is about 50 miles east." And the laughter that followed was harsh and grating, like crows cawing over carrion. Clara turned slowly, fixing them with a steady gaze that made the youngest of the 3 shift uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice carrying despite its softness. There was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that didn't match her modest appearance. She walked past them toward the general store, her spurs jingling softly with each step. Through the window, she could see the store owner watching nervously as she approached. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone would know that a stranger had arrived on the most important day Dry Creek had seen in months. The bell above the door chimed as Clara entered. The store smelled of leather, tobacco, and the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in West Texas. Behind the counter, a nervous-looking man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose looked up from his ledger. "Afternoon, miss. Can I help you with something?" His voice carried the uncertainty of a man unsure whether to be helpful or suspicious. "I need directions to the Henderson place," Clara said, pulling off her gloves, finger by finger. "I understand. There's an auction there today." The store owner, Thompson, according to the faded sign outside, blinked rapidly. "Well, yes, there is, but—" "Forgive me for asking, miss, but are you planning to bid on something?" Clara smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "I'm planning to pay my respects." Thompson fidgeted with his spectacles. "It's just that, well, it's mostly cattle and farm equipment going up for sale. And the land, of course. Big spreads, thousands of acres. It's not exactly—" He trailed off, clearly struggling to find a polite way to say what he was thinking. "Not exactly the place for a woman like me," Clara finished for him. "I didn't mean any offense, miss. It's just that the bidding, well, it's expected to be quite substantial. The Henderson spread is one of the finest in 3 counties. Clara nodded slowly, absorbing this information. She'd expected as much. The Henderson place had been the crown jewel of the area for as long as anyone could remember. Rolling pastures, prime water rights, and a main house that had hosted governors and cattle barons alike. "Much obliged for the information," she said, pulling her gloves back on. "Which way?" Thompson gave her directions, his voice growing more uncertain with each word. As Clara turned to leave, he called out after her, "Miss, might I ask your name? For when folks ask who was inquiring?" Clara paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. "Clara Hartwell," she said without turning around. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the tick of the store's old clock. When she glanced back, Thompson's face had gone pale, his mouth slightly agape. "Hartwell," he whispered. "That's right." Clara's voice was steady, giving nothing away. But you can't be. The Hartwells haven't been in these parts for 23 years, Clara finished. "I know." She left Thompson standing there, his questions hanging in the air like smoke. Outside, the men on the saloon porch had been joined by others, and their conversation died as she emerged. Clara could feel the weight of their stares, hear the urgent whispers that started the moment she was out of earshot. Let them talk, she thought as she untied her horse. Let them wonder. They'd have their answers soon enough. The ride to the Henderson place took 40 minutes, following a well-worn trail that cut through scrubland dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Clara had travelled this path before, though not for over 2 decades. The landscape was exactly as she remembered, harsh and unforgiving, but beautiful in its own way. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and the air carried the scent of sage and possibility. As she crested a small hill, the Henderson Ranch spread out before her like a picture from a dream. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and white columns that had somehow managed to stay pristine despite the harsh climate. Behind it, the barns and outbuildings were arranged with military precision, and beyond that, the pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. But it was the crowd gathered near the main barn that drew Clara's attention. At least 50 people had assembled for the auction, their horses and wagons creating a small temporary village. Most were men, ranchers, businessmen, and speculators who'd traveled from as far away as Dallas and San Antonio for a chance to bid on prime Texas real estate. Clara guided her horse down the hill, her heart beating faster with each step. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for, planning for, dreaming about for more years than she cared to count. Everything hinged on the next few hours. As she approached the crowd, conversations gradually died. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and more than a few men removed their hats in automatic politeness before remembering that they weren't sure this woman deserved their courtesy. Clara dismounted and tied her horse to a fence post at the edge of the gathering. The auctioneer, a large man with a voice designed to carry across county lines, was already setting up his podium near the barn. Beside him, clerks arranged papers and prepared to record the day's transactions. "Well, well," came a familiar voice. Clara turned to see the 3 men from the saloon had followed her, along with several others. The heavy-set one with grey whiskers stepped forward, emboldened by his audience. "If it isn't our mysterious lady. Come to watch the big boys play?" A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby crowd. Clara met his gaze steadily, noting the way he puffed up with confidence now that he had an audience. "Something like that," she replied. "Name's Buck Morrison," the man continued, clearly enjoying himself. "I own the spread just north of here. Been ranching this area for 30 years. He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd. "Most of us have been neighbors for decades. Can't say I recognize you, though." "I'm not from around here," Clara said simply. "That much is obvious," Morrison chuckled. "But you know this ain't exactly a social gathering. This is serious business. Big money changing hands. Might be more excitement than you're looking for." The insult was delivered with a smile, but its intent was clear. Around them, men nodded and murmured agreement. Clara was an outsider, a woman, and clearly someone of modest means. She had no business being here among the serious buyers. "I appreciate the concern," Clara said, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the amusement. "But I can handle myself." Another man stepped forward, younger than Morrison, with a perfectly groomed moustache and clothes that spoke of money. "Perhaps what Mr. Morrison is trying to say, miss, is that this auction will likely see bids in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Henderson place is legendary. It's not for the likes of me," Clara finished, her eyes flashing. The man had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I didn't mean to imply—" "Of course you did." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "You all did, and that's fine. Everyone's entitled to their assumptions. She turned away from them, moving closer to the auctioneer's podium. Behind her, she could hear the resumed conversations, the speculation about who she was and what she was doing there. Let them wonder, let them underestimate her. She'd spent years planning for this moment, years preparing for exactly this scenario. The auctioneer banged his gavel, the sharp crack echoing across the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, "welcome to the Henderson Ranch auction. We'll be starting with the livestock, then moving on to equipment, and finishing with the land parcels. For those of you interested in the full property, bidding on the main ranch will begin at 6 o'clock sharp." Clara checked the watch pinned to her jacket. 5:15. She had 45 minutes to endure their mockery, their dismissal, their absolute certainty that she didn't belong here. 45 minutes until she proved them all wrong. The auction began with the livestock, and Clara found herself swept up in memories as the auctioneer's rapid-fire cadence filled the air. She remembered standing in this very spot as a child, her father's hand resting protectively on her shoulder as he pointed out the finest cattle in the region. Back then, the Henderson Ranch had been their neighbor, their friend, their ally in the constant struggle against drought, disease, and the harsh realities of ranching life. Lot 17, prime Hereford bull, 3 years old, excellent breeding stock, the auctioneer called out, starting at $500. Hands shot up across the crowd, and Clara watched the practiced dance of competitive bidding. These men knew each other's tells, their bidding patterns, their financial limits. They'd been doing business together for decades, a closed circle of mutual respect and calculated rivalry. She stood at the edge of the group, close enough to hear, but removed enough to observe. The conversations around her provided a constant stream of information. Who was buying, who was saving their money for the land, who had the financial backing to make a serious run at the whole property. "I heard Jameson brought a banker down from Dallas," one man whispered to another. "Morrison's been saving for 2 years, ever since old Henderson took sick," came the reply. "My money's on the syndicate from Austin. They've got more capital than God." Clara absorbed it all, filing away each detail. Knowledge was power, and she'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between success and failure. She'd spent months researching every potential bidder, understanding their financial situations, their motivations, their limits. "You still here, darling?" Buck Morrison appeared at her elbow, his breath heavy with whiskey, despite the early hour. "Thought you might have gotten bored and headed back to town." "I'm exactly where I want to be," Clara replied without looking at him. Morrison chuckled, the sound more harsh than amused. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about your name being Hartwell." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone. "There used to be Hartwells around here, way back, but that was a long time ago, before they what?" Clara asked, finally turning to face him. Morrison's smile faltered slightly. There was something in Clara's eyes that warned him he was treading on dangerous ground. "Well, before they left, I suppose. Economic troubles, if I recall correctly." "Is that what you recall?" Clara's voice was deceptively calm. "Now, don't get yourself worked up," Morrison said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "It's just gossip, probably not even true. Small towns, you know how it is. Stories get embellished over time." Clara knew exactly how it was. She'd lived with those embellished stories, those half-truths and outright lies, for over 20 years. The Hartwell name had become a cautionary tale in Dry Creek, a warning about what happened to families who overextended themselves, who trusted the wrong people, who let pride cloud their judgment. "The way I heard it," Morrison continued, apparently unable to leave well enough alone, "old Jake Hartwell thought he could play with the big boys. Borrowed against his land, made some bad investments. When the debts came due," he shrugged eloquently. "When the debts came due, what?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison glanced around nervously, suddenly aware that their conversation had drawn the attention of nearby men. "Well," He lost everything, didn't he? The whole spread went to pay his creditors. Families scattered to the wind. Sad story, really. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Clara stared at Morrison with an intensity that made him shift his weight from foot to foot. Around them, other conversations had stopped as men strained to hear what was being said. "That's an interesting version of events," Clara said finally. "Version?" Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "What do you mean, version? I mean, that's not how it happened at all." Before Morrison could respond, the auctioneer's gavel cracked again. "That concludes our livestock auction. We'll take a 15-minute break before moving on to equipment and machinery." The crowd began to disperse, men gathering in small groups to discuss what they'd seen and plan their strategies for the remaining lots. Clara used the opportunity to move away from Morrison, who stood staring after her with a confused expression. She walked toward the main house, needing a moment to collect herself. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In the distance, she could hear the gentle lowing of cattle and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. "Miss Hartwell?" Clara turned to find a woman approaching, middle-aged with greying hair pulled back in a sensible bun, and kind eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and concern. She wore a simple dress that spoke of modest means but good quality, and her hands showed the calluses of honest work. "I'm sorry," the woman continued. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Buck Morrison. I'm Martha Phillips. My husband owns the small spread just east of here. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Phillips." Martha glanced around nervously, as if afraid they might be overheard. "I wanted to speak with you because I remember your father." Clara's breath caught. "You do?" "Oh, yes. Jake Hartwell was a good man, one of the finest I ever knew. My husband and I were just starting out when everything happened. Your father helped us through our first hard winter, lent us cattle when ours died in the freeze of 71. Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We never forgot his kindness." "Thank you," Clara said softly. "That means more to me than you know. I wanted you to know that not everyone believed the stories that went around after you all left. Some of us knew better. Your father was honest as the day is long. If he lost his land, it wasn't because of poor judgment or bad investments." Clara studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine warmth and concern. "What do you think happened, Mrs. Phillips?" Martha glanced around again, then stepped closer. "I think Jake Hartwell was cheated out of his birthright by men who wanted what he had and were willing to do whatever it took to get it. I think the real story never got told because the people who could have told it were either bought off or scared off." A chill ran down Clara's spine. This was closer to the truth than she'd expected to hear from anyone in Dry Creek. "Do you have any proof of that?" "Proof?" Martha shook her head sadly. "No, nothing that would stand up in court. But I have eyes and ears, and I remember how quickly certain people prospered after your family's misfortune. I remember who suddenly had money to buy up land that should have been beyond their means." Before Clara could ask for more details, Martha's husband appeared at her side, a weathered man with gentle eyes and work-roughened hands. "Tom Phillips," he said, extending his hand to Clara. "I've been wanting to meet Jake Hartwell's daughter for 23 years. Clara shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that matched his wife's. "Your wife was just telling me about my father's kindness to you both." Tom nodded gravely. "Your father saved our ranch, miss. We were green as grass, didn't know a blessed thing about raising cattle in Texas. Jake took us under his wing, taught us everything we needed to know, never asked for anything in return. He was that kind of man," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Which is why what happened to him was such a damn shame," Tom continued, his voice hardening. "Pardon my language, but it burns me up to think about it even now. Jake Hartwell never borrowed money against his land, never made risky investments. He was too careful, too smart." Martha placed a warning hand on her husband's arm. "Tom, no, Martha. This girl has a right to know." Tom turned back to Clara, his eyes blazing with old anger. "Your father was set up, miss. Plain and simple. Someone wanted the Hartwell spread, and they were willing to forge documents and buy false testimony to get it." Clara's heart was pounding now. Who? Who would do such a thing? Tom opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a loud voice interrupted them. "Well, look here. The mysterious lady has found herself some friends." Buck Morrison approached with several other men in tow, his earlier nervousness replaced by renewed confidence. The whiskey on his breath was stronger now, and his face was flushed with alcohol and heat. "I hope the Phillips have been filling you in on local history," Morrison continued, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "They've got quite the collection of stories, don't you, Tom?" Tom Phillips straightened, his jaw clenched. "Just telling Miss Hartwell about her father. You remember Jake Hartwell, don't you, Buck?" The tension between the two men was palpable. Clara sensed years of history, of disagreements and resentments that ran deeper than simple neighborly disputes. "Of course I remember old Jake," Morrison replied smoothly. "Shame what happened to him, but that's ancient history now, isn't it? No point dwelling on the past." "Some folks might disagree with that," Tom said quietly. Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Some folks need to learn when to keep their mouths shut." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Clara stepped between the two men, her presence breaking the mounting tension. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I believe the auctioneer is ready to resume." Indeed, the auctioneer was calling for attention, his voice booming across the crowd. The equipment auction was about to begin, and serious buyers were positioning themselves for the next round of bidding. Morrison gave Tom Phillips one last hard look before turning away. "Come on, boys, let's go see if there's anything worth buying." As the men dispersed, Martha Phillips touched Clara's arm gently. "Be careful, dear. There are forces at work here that you don't fully understand yet." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some people have spent a lot of years making sure the truth about your father never came to light. They won't be happy to see a Hartwell back in Dry Creek, especially not on auction day." Tom nodded grimly. "Martha's right. You've stirred up a hornet's nest just by being here. If you're planning what I think you're planning." "What do you think I'm planning?" Clara asked. Tom studied her face for a long moment. "I think you're here to buy back what was stolen from your family, and I think you've got the means to do it, or you wouldn't have come." Clara didn't confirm or deny his suspicion. Instead, she simply said, "If that were true, would you support it?" "With everything we've got," Martha said immediately. "Your father deserves justice, even if it's 23 years late." "But be ready for a fight," Tom added, "because the people who profited from your family's misfortune won't give up without one." The auctioneer's gavel cracked again, calling the crowd to order. Clara thanked the Phillips and made her way back toward the main gathering, her mind racing with everything she'd learned. The equipment auction proceeded quickly, plows, harrows, tractors, and various farm implements changing hands with efficient precision. Clara noted which bidders were active and which were conserving their resources, building a mental map of the financial landscape she was about to enter. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, the moment of truth approached. The land auction would begin soon, and with it, Clara's chance to reclaim her birthright, or lose everything in the attempt. The equipment auction concluded just as the sun began to paint the sky in deeper shades of orange and purple. Clara watched the last piece of machinery, a nearly new grain harvester, sell to a consortium from San Antonio for $12,000. The bidding had been spirited but professional, giving her valuable insight into the strategies and financial capabilities of the men around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying easily across the crowd, "we'll take a 30-minute break before beginning the land auction. For those interested in the individual parcels, we'll start with the smaller lots and work our way up to the main property. Refreshments are available on the porch of the main house." The crowd began to move toward the house, conversations resuming with renewed intensity. Clara noticed how the groups had shifted during the day, alliances forming, rivals positioning themselves, money men conferring with their financial backers. The real players were becoming clear, separated from the curious onlookers and small bidders. She made her way to the porch, but avoided the refreshment table, instead finding a quiet corner where she could observe without being drawn into unwanted conversations. From here, she had a perfect view of the main gathering, and more importantly, they had a clear view of her. "Quite a turnout," said a voice behind her. Clara turned to find a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, impeccably dressed despite the rural setting. His suit was tailored, his boots were expensive leather, and his demeanor spoke of serious money and serious intentions. "Indeed it is," Clara replied cautiously. "Charles Jameson," the man said, extending a manicured hand. "I represent a group of investors from Dallas. We're here for the main property." Clara shook his hand, noting the soft skin of someone who'd never done manual labor. Clara Hartwell. If Jameson recognized the name, he didn't show it. "First time at a ranch auction, Miss Hartwell?" "Something like that." Jameson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It can be quite an experience. The amounts of money involved, the intensity of the competition. Not everyone is prepared for how aggressive things can become." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I imagine it separates the serious buyers from the curious." "Exactly." Jameson's smile widened slightly. "Though I have to admit I'm curious about your interest in the proceedings. Are you here representing someone, perhaps? A relative looking to invest in ranch land?" The question was casual, but Clara heard the probing beneath it. Word of her presence had spread, and the serious buyers were trying to assess whether she represented a threat to their plans. "I'm here for myself," Clara said simply. Jameson's eyebrows rose slightly. Well, that's admirable. Though I hope you understand that the bidding on the main ranch is expected to reach quite substantial figures. Our group alone is prepared to bid up to $800,000. The number hung in the air between them like a challenge. Clara maintained her calm expression, but internally she felt a surge of satisfaction. Jameson was trying to intimidate her, to establish the financial playing field and warn her away from competition that was beyond her means. "That's a significant investment," Clara acknowledged. "Indeed. Though for a property of this caliber, with this much prime grazing land and these water rights, it's actually quite reasonable." Jameson paused, studying Clara's face for any reaction. "Of course, that assumes one has access to such capital." The insult was delivered with practiced smoothness, but it was still an insult. Clara felt her temper stir but kept her voice level. "I suppose we'll see what the market determines the property is worth." Before Jameson could respond, another voice cut through their conversation. "Jameson, there you are!" Buck Morrison approached with several other men, his face flushed and his movements slightly unsteady. He'd clearly taken advantage of the refreshment break to fortify himself with liquid courage. "Morrison," Jameson replied coolly, "how are the preparations going?" "Good, good. Though I've got to ask, what's your read on the competition? I see some faces I don't recognize." His eyes fixed on Clara as he spoke, making it clear who he was really asking about. "Miss Hartwell was just telling me about her interest in the property," Jameson said smoothly. "Perhaps you two know each other?" Morrison's laugh was harsh and loud enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. "Oh, we've met, haven't we, darling? Our mysterious lady here claims to be a Hartwell. You know, the Hartwells who used to own land around here before they... "Before they what?" Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through Morrison's bluster like a blade. Morrison paused, suddenly aware that their conversation had drawn a considerable audience. Men were turning from other discussions, drinks forgotten in their hands as they sensed drama developing. "Well, before they lost it all, of course," Morrison continued, his voice slightly less confident than before. "Everyone knows the story." "Do they?" Clara stepped closer to Morrison. close enough that he had to look down at her but could still hear every word clearly. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what exactly do you know about how my family lost their land?" The porch had gone quiet except for the soft creaking of wood and the distant sound of cattle. Every man within earshot was listening now, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Morrison glanced around nervously, suddenly realizing he'd walked into territory he wasn't prepared to defend. "Well, That is, everyone knows that Jake Hartwell borrowed against his property and couldn't pay his debts." "Everyone knows that," Clara repeated softly. "And how exactly does everyone know that, Mr. Morrison?" It's common knowledge. Public record." "Public record?" Clara nodded slowly. "And you've seen these records yourself, have you?" Morrison's face was growing redder by the moment. "I don't need to see records to know what happened. It was the talk of the county." "Talk," Clara said, her voice growing sharper. "Gossip. Stories told by people who weren't there, about events they didn't witness, concerning documents they never read." The crowd was pressing closer now, drawn by the mounting tension. Clara could see the faces around her, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly hostile. These were the people who had lived with the accepted version of her family's story for over 2 decades, and she was challenging the very foundation of that narrative. "Now see here," Morrison blustered, "I won't be questioned by some what?" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "Some woman? Some outsider? Some Hartwell?" The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the sound of her own heartbeat. Morrison stood frozen, his mouth half open, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't make his situation worse. It was Jameson who broke the silence, his smooth voice cutting through the tension. "Perhaps we should all focus on the business at hand. The auction will be resuming shortly." But Clara wasn't finished. She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "My father, Jake Hartwell, owned 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land in West Texas. He built that ranch from nothing, through 20 years of hard work and sacrifice. He never borrowed against his land because he didn't believe in risking what couldn't be replaced. He never made risky investments because he understood that the land was worth more than any speculative venture." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men nodded, remembering Jake Hartwell as Clara described him. Others looked uncomfortable, unwilling to challenge the accepted story, but unable to dismiss her words entirely. "Yet somehow," Clara continued, "within 6 months of his death, that land was gone, seized for debts that appeared overnight, sold to satisfy creditors who had never been seen before and were never seen again. Documents surfaced that no one in the family had ever signed. Witnesses testified to agreements that never existed." The murmurs were growing louder now, and Clara could see the effect her words were having. Tom Phillips was nodding grimly, while Martha stood nearby with tears in her eyes. Other faces showed confusion, doubt, and in some cases, what looked like guilt. "Now that's quite an accusation," Jameson said carefully. "Are you suggesting that your father was the victim of some sort of fraud?" Clara turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Jameson. I'm stating a fact. My father was cheated out of his land by people who wanted what he had and were willing to break the law to get it." The crowd erupted in excited conversation. Some men were arguing loudly, others were asking questions, and a few were backing away as if they didn't want to be associated with the discussion. Through it all, Clara stood calmly in the center of the storm she had created. "That's a hell of an accusation," called out a voice from the back of the crowd. "You got any proof of that?" Clara smiled, and for the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, it was a smile of genuine pleasure. "As a matter of fact, I do." The crowd fell silent again, every man straining to hear what she would say next. "But proof is for courtrooms," Clara continued. "Today is auction day, and I came here to buy back what was stolen from my family." Morrison finally found his voice again, though it cracked with tension. "Buy back? With what money? You can't possibly have the kind of capital needed to compete for this property." Clara reached into her jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, worn but well-maintained. From it she pulled a single piece of paper, unfolding it carefully. "This is a bank draft from the First National Bank of San Francisco," she announced, holding the document high enough for everyone to see. "Made out to me, Clara Hartwell, in the amount of $1 million. The silence that followed was so profound that Clara could hear the wind rustling through the grass in the distant pasture. Men stared at the document in her hand, with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to calculation. Morrison was the first to recover, though his voice was still strained. That can't be real. Where would someone like you get that kind of money?" Clara folded the bank draft carefully and returned it to her portfolio. "Someone like me, Mr. Morrison. Someone whose family was driven off their land by lies and forgery. Someone who has spent 23 years working, saving, and planning for this exact moment." She looked around the crowd, meeting the eyes of every man who would hold her gaze. "I've been waiting for this day since I was 16 years old. Waiting for the chance to come back to Dry Creek and set the record straight. Waiting for the opportunity to prove that the Hartwell name means something more than the lies that have been told about us." The auctioneer's bell rang, calling the crowd back to the main area for the land auction. But no one moved immediately. They stood transfixed, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A woman had arrived in their midst, claiming to be the daughter of a man they remembered, but whose story they had accepted without question. She had challenged their assumptions, accused respected members of their community of fraud, and produced evidence of financial resources that none of them had imagined possible. And now she was preparing to bid against them for the most valuable property in 3 counties. As the crowd slowly began to move toward the auction area, Clara caught sight of Morrison's face. The bluster and casual cruelty were gone, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "Good," she thought. "It's about time someone in this town remembered what it felt like to be afraid." The real auction was about to begin. The auction area had been transformed during the break. Additional seating had been arranged in rough semicircles around the auctioneer's podium, with the serious bidders positioned in the front rows where they could easily be seen and heard. Behind them, observers and smaller players filled in the remaining spaces, creating an amphitheater-like atmosphere charged with anticipation and tension. Clara chose a seat in the second row, close enough to participate actively, but positioned where she could observe the reactions of the major players. She noticed how the seating arrangements had shifted since her revelation about the bank draft. The comfortable proximity of earlier had been replaced by wary distance as potential competitors reassessed the landscape. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice commanding attention across the assembled crowd, "we're about to begin the land portion of today's auction. We'll start with the smaller parcels and work our way up to the main property. I want to remind all bidders that these are cash sales, with full payment required within 30 days of the auction's conclusion." He gestured toward his assistant, who held up a detailed map of the Henderson Ranch property. "Our first lot is a 40-acre parcel on the eastern boundary, prime grazing land with access to Little Creek. We'll start the bidding at $1,000. Hands went up immediately, and Clara watched the rhythm of competitive bidding unfold. The smaller lots attracted local ranchers looking to expand their holdings, men who knew the value of every acre and bid with careful precision. The amounts were significant by local standards, but modest compared to what everyone knew was coming. Lot by lot, pieces of the Henderson legacy changed hands. Clara noted which bidders were active and which were holding back, mentally cataloguing their strategies and financial reserves. She participated in the bidding on 2 smaller parcels, not because she wanted them, but to establish her credibility as a serious player and to test the waters. On the first parcel, she bid actively up to $3,000 before withdrawing, letting a local rancher take it for $3,500. On the second, she pushed harder, finally winning a 20-acre plot with water rights for $4,800. The crowd watched these transactions with intense interest, trying to gauge her bidding style and financial limits. "Interesting strategy," Charles Jameson murmured from his seat nearby. "Establishing your presence before the main event." Clara didn't respond, but she noticed how his comment carried clearly to the surrounding audience. Everything here was theater, every word and gesture calculated for maximum psychological impact. As the afternoon wore on, the lots grew larger and the bidding more intense. A 100-acre section with prime grazing sold for $18,000. A parcel with valuable water rights brought $25,000. With each sale, the tension ratcheted higher as everyone calculated how much money was being spent and how much remained for the final prize. "That concludes our individual lot sales," the auctioneer announced as the sun began to sink lower in the western sky. "We'll take a brief recess before beginning the auction for the main Henderson Ranch property. 8,000 acres, including the main house, all buildings, equipment not previously sold, and all water and mineral rights." The crowd stirred restlessly. This was what they had all come for, the moment that would determine the future of one of Texas's most legendary ranches. During the recess, Clara noticed how the serious bidders positioned themselves, Jameson conferring quietly with his financial backers, Morrison surrounded by a group of local ranchers who had clearly pooled their resources, and several other players she hadn't yet identified making final preparations. She remained in her seat, projecting calm confidence while her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the culmination of over 2 decades of planning, working and waiting. Everything she had built, everything she had saved, everything she had sacrificed was about to be put to the test. "Miss Hartwell?" She turned to find Tom Phillips approaching cautiously, his wife Martha close behind. Their faces showed a mixture of excitement and concern. "We just wanted to wish you luck," Martha said softly, "and to let you know that there are folks here pulling for you." "More than you might think," Tom added. "Word's been spreading about what you said earlier. Some people are remembering things they'd tried to forget." Clara felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you both. That means everything to me." "Just remember," Tom said quietly, "you're not just bidding on land. You're bidding on justice. Don't let them intimidate you." As the Phillips moved away, Clara noticed other faces in the crowd. People who nodded at her with what looked like encouragement, others who averted their eyes as if ashamed of their own silence. The story she had told was spreading, creating ripples of doubt about the accepted narrative of her family's downfall. The auctioneer's bell rang again, calling everyone back to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the main event of today's auction. The Henderson Ranch main property, 8,000 acres of prime Texas rangeland, including the main house, barns, equipment sheds, and all water rights. This is one of the finest ranching properties in the state, with a proven track record of profitability and unlimited potential for growth." He paused, letting the magnitude of the moment settle over the crowd. "Given the nature and value of this property, we'll start the bidding at $200,000. A hand shot up immediately, Jameson establishing his presence from the outset. "I have 200,000, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 250? Morrison's hand went up. 250 from Mr. Morrison. "Do I hear 300? Another hand, a man Clara didn't recognize, clearly representing serious money. 300,000. "Do I hear 350? The bidding moved quickly through the opening rounds, each increment representing more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Clara waited, watching, learning the rhythm and style of each bidder. She wanted to understand their patterns before she entered the fray. "I have 500,000, the auctioneer announced as Jameson raised his hand again. "Do I hear 550? Morrison hesitated for the first time, clearly reaching the limits of his consortium's resources. The bid went to a new player, a representative from Austin who had been quiet all day. 550 from the gentleman from Austin. "Do I hear 600? Jameson nodded immediately. The message was clear. He was prepared to go much higher and wanted to pressure the smaller players out of the bidding. 600,000. Do I hear 650? The Austin representative shook his head and leaned back in his chair, effectively withdrawing from the competition. Morrison looked agonized, but also shook his head, finally reaching his limit. 600,000 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Clara's hand went up. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads swiveled, and every eye in the crowd fixed on her. The auctioneer paused, his gavel halfway to the podium. "I have 650 from Miss Hartwell," he announced, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Do I hear 700? Jameson turned in his seat to stare at Clara, his polished composure slipping for the first time. She met his gaze steadily, her expression calm and determined. 700,000, Jameson called out, his voice slightly strained. "I have 700, the auctioneer confirmed. "Do I hear 750? Clara raised her hand again without hesitation. 750 from Miss Hartwell. "Do I hear 800? The crowd was buzzing now, the excitement palpable. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a duel between the established money and the returning daughter, between the accepted order and the challenge to everything they thought they knew. Jameson was conferring urgently with his backers, clearly discussing whether to exceed their planned limit. After a tense moment, he raised his hand. 800,000 from Mr. Jameson. "Do I hear 850? This was the moment Clara had been waiting for, the point where she would either establish her dominance or be forced to retreat. She stood up slowly, drawing every eye in the crowd to her. 900,000, she called out clearly. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. $900,000, more money than had ever been bid on a single property in the history of Dry Creek, possibly in the history of West Texas. Jameson's face had gone pale. This was well beyond what his group had authorized, and they would need time to arrange additional financing, but time was not something he had. "I have 900,000 from Miss Hartwell," the auctioneer announced, his voice barely concealing his amazement. "Do I hear 950? Jameson started to raise his hand, then stopped, clearly struggling with the decision. The amount was staggering, pushing far beyond rational market value into the realm of pure determination. 900,000 going once, the auctioneer called. Morrison was staring at Clara with a mixture of shock and something that looked very much like fear. Around the crowd, men were whispering urgently, trying to process what they were witnessing. "Going twice." Jameson's hand stayed down. His financial backers were shaking their heads, clearly unwilling to authorize such an enormous expenditure. "Sold!" But the auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "The Henderson Ranch property has been sold to Miss Clara Hartwell for $900,000. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some people were cheering, others arguing loudly, and still others sitting in stunned silence. Through it all, Clara remained standing, her calm expression masking the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. She had done it. After 23 years of exile, years of working and saving and planning, she had reclaimed her birthright. The land that had been stolen from her family was hers again. But as the initial shock began to wear off, Clara could see the calculation beginning in the eyes around her. $900,000 in cash was more money than most people could imagine, and the questions about where she had acquired such wealth were just beginning. Morrison pushed through the crowd toward her, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Where did you get that kind of money?" he demanded loudly. "No woman, especially no Hartwell, has access to those kinds of funds." Clara looked at him calmly. "Are you questioning my ability to pay, Mr. Morrison? Because I assure you the bank draft is legitimate." "Bank draft, hell!" Morrison snarled. "I want to know where a woman like you got almost $1 million in cash." The crowd pressed closer, clearly eager to hear the answer. This was the question everyone had been thinking, but hadn't dared ask, until now. Clara smiled. and this time there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "I earned it, Mr. Morrison. Every single dollar. Through 23 years of hard work in San Francisco." "Doing what?" Morrison pressed, his implications clear and ugly. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice level and clear. "I owned and operated a freight company," she said. "Hartwell Shipping and Transport. We moved goods from the docks to the inland towns, and we did it better, faster, and more efficiently than anyone else." The explanation was simple and believable, but Clara could see that Morrison wasn't satisfied. Neither were several other men in the crowd who seemed unwilling to accept that a woman, especially a Hartwell, could have achieved such success. "A freight company," Morrison repeated skeptically, "and this freight company just happened to make you rich enough to buy the most expensive ranch in Texas." "The freight company made me rich enough to buy back what was stolen from my family," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." Before Morrison could respond, the auctioneer's assistant approached with a clipboard full of paperwork. "Miss Hartwell, we'll need to complete the sale documentation. Will you be paying with the bank draft you mentioned?" Clara nodded and withdrew the portfolio from her jacket. Under the fascinated gaze of the entire crowd, she unfolded the bank draft and handed it to the assistant, who examined it carefully before nodding his approval. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced. "The sale is complete." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement and speculation, Clara remained standing in the spot where she had reclaimed her heritage. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, and in the distance she could see the land that was hers again. The land that had been in her family for generations until it was stolen by lies and forgery. But even as she savored the moment of victory, Clara knew that her real challenges were just beginning. She had made powerful enemies today, and they would not simply accept her return without a fight. The battle for the Henderson Ranch was over. The war for the truth about her family's legacy had just begun. The crowd dispersed slowly as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the Henderson Ranch in golden light that seemed to make everything sacred and eternal. Clara stood near the auctioneer's podium, completing the final paperwork for the sale, while conversations swirled around her like dust devils in the evening wind. "Sign here and here," the auctioneer's assistant directed, pointing to various lines on the deed transfer documents. "And we'll need a witness for this section." Tom Phillips stepped forward immediately. "I'll witness it," he said firmly, taking the pen when Clara finished signing. His signature was strong and clear, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude for his public support. As the official business concluded, Clara became aware of intense scrutiny from several directions. Charles Jameson had not left with his group, but stood nearby with two other well-dressed men, their conversation urgent and their glances in her direction frequent and calculating. Buck Morrison was surrounded by a cluster of local ranchers, their voices low, but their agitation obvious. "Miss Hartwell? Miss—" Clara turned to find a young man approaching, perhaps 25, with the calloused hands of a working cowboy, but clothes that suggested he held a position of some responsibility. "I'm Jake Henderson, ma'am. Old Mr. Henderson was my grandfather." Clara studied his face, seeing the resemblance to the man she remembered from her childhood. "I remember your grandfather. He was a good neighbor to my family." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, ma'am. My grandfather left some things, some papers and such. Before he died, he told me that if a Hartwell ever came back to Dry Creek, I should make sure they saw what he'd kept." The words sent a chill down Clara's spine. "What kind of papers?" "Letters, mostly. And some documents that he said never made it to the courthouse when they should have. He always felt bad about what happened to your family, said things weren't right, but he was too old and too sick to fight it." Before Clara could respond, Buck Morrison's voice cut through the evening air like a rusty blade. "Well, look here, the new owner's already making friends." Morrison approached with several men in tow, his gait unsteady and his words slurred. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, when exactly do you plan to take possession of your inheritance?" The way he said the last word dripped with sarcasm and suspicion. Clara kept her voice level. "The paperwork indicates I have immediate possession, Mr. Morrison. Is there something you need to discuss?" "Oh, there's plenty to discuss," Morrison said, his voice rising. "Like how a woman who left here with nothing comes back with enough money to outbid every serious rancher in 3 counties, like where that money really came from." The group around Morrison murmured agreement, and Clara realized this wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. They had been planning this, working up their courage and their anger while she completed the sale. "I've already explained where the money came from," Clara said calmly. "My shipping business in San Francisco." "Shipping business?" one of Morrison's companions repeated mockingly. "That's rich, a Hartwell running a successful business. We all know how good your family was with money." Clara felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Tom Phillips stepped forward. "That's enough," Phillips said firmly. "The lady's paid fair and square, and the sale is legal. What she did with her life after leaving Dry Creek is her own business." "Is it?" Morrison's eyes glittered with malice. "Because I've been thinking about this all afternoon, and something doesn't add up. $900,000 is a lot of money, more than most people see in a lifetime. And it came awfully conveniently, didn't it? Right when the Henderson place was going up for auction?" "What are you implying?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. Morrison leaned closer, his breath heavy with whiskey and malice. "I'm implying that maybe your money didn't come from any shipping business. Maybe it came from someone who wanted to see this property in particular hands. Maybe you're not the real buyer at all, just a front for someone else." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the remaining crowd pressed closer, sensing drama and conflict. Clara could see faces in the gathering darkness, some sympathetic, some hostile, many simply curious about how she would respond. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Morrison," Clara said quietly. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" "I have common sense," Morrison shot back. "And I know that no woman builds a business successful enough to make her rich, especially not a woman from a family that couldn't manage their own affairs." The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to provoke Clara into an emotional response that would undermine her credibility. Instead, she smiled, and the expression was colder than the evening wind beginning to stir the grass. "You know, Mr. Morrison, you keep talking about my family's supposed inability to manage their affairs, but you seem remarkably well informed about the details of their downfall for someone who claims it was just common knowledge." Morrison's face flushed deeper. "Everyone knows what happened. Everyone knows the story that was told," Clara corrected. "But I'm beginning to wonder how that story got started. Who first claimed that my father had borrowed against his land? Who produced the documents that supposedly proved his debts? Who found the witnesses who testified to agreements that never existed?" She stepped closer to Morrison, her voice dropping but carrying clearly in the still air. "Most importantly, who benefited when the Hartwell land was sold to satisfy those mysterious debts?" The silence that followed was profound. Clara could see the impact of her words on the faces around her. Confusion, doubt, and in some cases what looked very much like guilt. It was Charles Jameson who broke the silence, his smooth voice cutting through the tension. "These are fascinating historical questions, Miss Hartwell, but they don't change the reality of the present situation. You've made a very large investment in property that will require substantial ongoing capital to operate profitably. I hope you've considered the practical aspects of ranch management." Clara turned to face him, recognizing the shift in tactics. Unable to challenge her right to buy the property, they were now questioning her ability to keep it. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Jameson," she replied, "but I think you'll find that I've done my homework quite thoroughly." "Have you?" Jameson's smile was patronizing. "Ranching is a complex business, requiring extensive knowledge of livestock, land management, weather patterns, market conditions. It's not something one can simply learn from books." "You're absolutely right," Clara agreed. which is why I spent the first 16 years of my life learning it from one of the finest ranches in Texas. My father may have lost his land, but he never lost his knowledge, and he made sure I understood every aspect of the business before circumstances forced us to leave. Young Jake Henderson stepped forward again, clearly emboldened by Clara's defense of her qualifications. If I may, Miss Hartwell, I'd like to offer my services. I've been managing the Henderson Ranch for the past 3 years, since my grandfather took sick. I know every acre, every water source, every head of cattle. If you're planning to continue ranching operations, I'd be honored to stay on. The offer was both practical and symbolic, a public endorsement from the Henderson family heir, lending credibility to Clara's position as the new owner. I appreciate that, Jake, Clara said warmly. I was hoping you'd consider staying. This land has been in your family for generations, and it needs someone who understands its history and potential. Morrison snorted derisively. Very touching. But running a ranch takes more than good intentions and family history. It takes capital. Lots of it. Feed costs, veterinary expenses, equipment maintenance, payroll. Are you prepared for those ongoing expenses, Miss Hartwell? Because if you're not, you'll lose this place just like your father lost his. The comparison to her father was deliberate and cruel, but Clara had been expecting it. Unlike my father, Mr. Morrison, I won't be starting with debt. The ranch is paid for, which means the operating capital can go directly into improvements and operations rather than servicing loans. Improvements, Jameson mused. Such as? Clara had spent years planning for this moment, and her response came without hesitation. New breeding stock to improve the herd genetics, upgraded water systems to maximize irrigation efficiency, modernized equipment to reduce labor costs and increase productivity, and most importantly, restoration of the land that's been overgrazed and underutilized. The specificity of her plans clearly surprised both Jameson and Morrison. This wasn't the response of someone making impulsive decisions or operating beyond her depth. That's a lot of ambitious talk, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. We'll see how it works out in practice. Yes, Clara replied evenly. We will. As the confrontation wound down, the crowd began to disperse for real this time. The excitement of the auction was over, replaced by the practical reality that business needed to resume. But Clara noticed that several people lingered, wanting to speak with her privately. Martha Phillips approached first, her eyes bright with emotion. I wanted to tell you how proud your father would be, she said softly. To see you standing up to those bullies, claiming what's rightfully yours, it would have made his heart sing. Thank you, Clara replied, touched by the genuine warmth in the woman's voice. And if you need anything at all, you just let Tom and me know. We remember our debts, and we remember our friends. As the Phillips walked away, Jake Henderson approached again, this time carrying a worn leather satchel. Miss Hartwell, about those papers I mentioned. My grandfather made me promise to keep them safe until a Hartwell came back. He said they were important, that they might help set the record straight someday. Clara accepted the satchel with hands that trembled slightly. The leather was old and well worn, and she could feel the weight of documents inside. What exactly did your grandfather tell you about these papers? Jake glanced around nervously, making sure they weren't being overheard. He said they were copies of documents that should have been filed at the courthouse, but never were. Letters between your father and his lawyer, bank records, things like that. He said the official story about your father's debts didn't match what he knew to be true. Clara's heart was racing. If these documents contained what Jake suggested, they might be the proof she needed to expose the fraud that had destroyed her family. Why didn't your grandfather come forward with these at the time? He tried, Jake said sadly, but he was just one voice against a lot of powerful people, and by the time he realized how serious it was, your family was already gone. He always regretted not doing more. Clara clutched the satchel to her chest, feeling the weight of 23 years of questions and pain. Thank you, Jake. This means more to me than you can possibly know. As Jake walked away, Clara found herself alone in the gathering dusk. The auctioneer and his staff had packed up and departed, leaving her standing on land that was finally legally hers again. In the distance, she could see the lights beginning to come on in the main house, her house now. But even as she savored the moment of victory, Clara knew that the real battle was just beginning. Morrison's questions about her money would spread, growing more elaborate and suspicious with each telling. Jameson's concerns about her ability to operate the ranch would be echoed by others who doubted a woman's capacity for such an undertaking. And somewhere in the satchel she carried were documents that might finally reveal the truth about her family's destruction, a truth that some people had spent decades keeping buried. Clara looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations, new tests of her determination and resolve. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, a Hartwell was home. Clara spent her first night back on Henderson land, her land now, in the guest room of the main house, surrounded by the ghosts of memories and the weight of unfinished business. She had dismissed Jake Henderson's offer to stay and help her settle in, needing solitude to process everything that had happened and to examine the contents of the leather satchel his grandfather had preserved. By lamplight, she carefully spread the documents across the large oak desk in what had been Henderson's study. The papers were yellowed with age, but remarkably well preserved, and as she began to read, a story emerged that was both vindication and revelation. The first document was a letter from her father to his lawyer, dated just 2 weeks before his death. In it, Jake Hartwell expressed concerns about irregularities in his financial records, discrepancies that suggested someone had been manipulating his accounts and forging his signature on documents. "I never authorized any loans against the ranch," her father had written in his careful hand. "The papers they're showing me bear my signature, but I swear to you, Samuel, I never signed such documents. Someone is trying to steal my land, and I need your help to prove it." Clara's hands trembled as she read her father's words. Here was proof that he had been aware of the fraud, that he had been fighting it before his sudden death from a heart attack had left the family vulnerable and defenseless. The next document was even more damning. A copy of a bank record showing that the supposed loans against the Hartwell Ranch had been arranged by Buck Morrison, acting as an intermediary for unnamed investors. Morrison had presented forged documents and false witnesses to secure the loans, then used his position as a respected local businessman to give credibility to the fraud. But it was the third document that made Clara's blood run cold. It was a letter from Morrison to someone identified only as CJ, almost certainly Charles Jameson, discussing their plan to acquire the Hartwell property through manufactured debt. "The old man is getting suspicious," Morrison had written, "but he won't live long enough to cause real problems. His ticker's been weak for years, and the stress of fighting the debt claims should finish him off soon enough. Once he's gone, the family will be too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to mount an effective defense." Clara set the letter down with shaking hands. Morrison hadn't just cheated her family, he had counted on her father's death as part of his plan. The callous calculation of it, the complete absence of human decency, made her stomach turn. There were more documents, bank records, correspondence, witness statements that contradicted the official testimony, all painting a picture of an elaborate conspiracy to steal the Hartwell Ranch. And at the center of it all was Buck Morrison, the man who had spent the afternoon mocking her and questioning her right to reclaim her heritage. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her examination of the papers. "Miss Hartwell," came Jake Henderson's voice. "I saw the light still on. Is everything all right?" Clara gathered the documents carefully before opening the door. Jake stood in the hallway with a concerned expression, clearly having noticed her emotional state. "I've been reading the papers your grandfather saved," she said. "Jake, these documents, they prove everything I've been saying about my family. They prove that we were the victims of fraud." Jake nodded grimly. Grandfather always said the truth would come out eventually. He felt terrible about not doing more at the time, but Morrison and his associates had a lot of influence. People were afraid to cross them. "Were afraid?" Clara caught the past tense. "What changed?" "Morrison's gotten careless over the years, arrogant. He's made enemies, and some of the people who were scared of him back then aren't scared anymore. Word of what you did today, standing up to him publicly, it's already spreading. People are talking." Clara felt a surge of hope. "What kind of talking?" "Or stories that have been whispered for years are being spoken out loud now. Questions about how Morrison afforded to expand his ranch so dramatically right after your family left. Suspicions about his business dealings with outsiders. Some folks are remembering things they saw and heard, but were too frightened to mention at the time." Jake paused, then continued more quietly. "There's going to be a meeting tomorrow night at the Phillips place. People who remember your father, who have doubts about the official story. They want to hear what you have to say." Clara felt her heart racing. This was the opportunity she had hoped for, but hardly dared expect. The chance to present the truth to people who had known her father and might be willing to help expose the lies that had destroyed him. "Will you be there?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. And I'll be bringing some of the other ranch hands from the area, people who worked for your father, who knew what kind of man he really was." After Jake left, Clara returned to the study and continued her examination of the documents. By the time the sun began to rise over the Texas landscape, she had assembled a complete picture of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family. Morrison, Jameson, and at least 3 other prominent businessmen had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to acquire valuable ranch land through manufactured debt and forged documents. But she also knew that documents alone wouldn't be enough. She needed witnesses, people who had been present during the relevant events and were willing to testify to what they had seen. And after 23 years, finding such people would be a challenge. The morning brought visitors to her door. Word of her purchase had spread throughout the county overnight, and a steady stream of people arrived to congratulate her, offer their services, or simply satisfy their curiosity about the woman who had shocked everyone at the auction. Among the early visitors was Dr. Samuel Winters, an elderly man with kind eyes and the careful movements of someone well into his 80s. "Miss Hartwell," he said when she answered his knock, "I was your father's physician. I wondered if I might have a word with you." Clara invited him into the main parlor, offering coffee and settling in to hear what he had to say. "I want you to know that I never believed the stories about your father's financial troubles," Dr. Winters began. "Jake Hartwell was one of the most careful, conservative men I ever knew. The idea that he would risk his family's security through reckless borrowing was completely contrary to his character." "Did you ever express those doubts publicly?" Clara asked. Dr. Winters looked uncomfortable. "I'm ashamed to say that I did not. I was a young physician then, just establishing my practice. Morrison and his associates were powerful men, and I was afraid of the consequences of challenging them." "What about my father's death? Was there anything suspicious about it?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment. "Your father died of a heart attack, that much is certain. But the stress he was under in those final weeks, it was extraordinary. He came to see me several times, complaining of chest pains and difficulty sleeping. He was convinced that someone was trying to destroy him, and the strain was affecting his health severely." Dr. Winters leaned forward in his chair. "Miss Hartwell, I've carried the guilt of my silence for 23 years. If there's anything I can do now to help set the record straight, I'm prepared to do it." Clara felt another piece of her case falling into place. A respected physician willing to testify about her father's state of mind, and the circumstances of his death would carry significant weight. The afternoon brought more visitors, including several ranch hands who had worked for her father and remembered the events surrounding the family's departure. Each conversation added details to the picture Clara was building. confirming that the official story had never made sense to the people who had known Jake Hartwell personally. As evening approached, Clara prepared for the meeting at the Phillips place. She selected the most important documents from her grandfather Henderson's collection and practiced how she would present her case to the assembled group. The Phillips ranch was modest compared to the Henderson spread, but it was well maintained and prosperous. When Clara arrived, she found nearly 30 people gathered in the main room: ranchers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and their wives. These were the backbone of the Dry Creek community, the people who remembered the past and cared about justice. Tom Phillips called the meeting to order with simple words. "We're here because a wrong was done 23 years ago, and we all know it. Miss Hartwell has come back to set things right, and it's time we helped her do it." Clara stood before the group, feeling the weight of their attention and their expectations. These people had known her father, had respected him, and had been forced to watch in silence as his reputation was destroyed and his family driven away. 23 years ago, she began, my father was accused of financial irresponsibility that led to the loss of our ranch. Tonight, I want to show you proof that those accusations were lies, and that my father was the victim of an elaborate fraud designed to steal his land. She began with the letter from her father to his lawyer, reading it aloud in the hushed room. Murmurs of anger and recognition rippled through the audience as they heard Jake Hartwell's own words describing the conspiracy against him. Next came the bank record showing Morrison's role in arranging the fraudulent loans, followed by the damning correspondence revealing the premeditated nature of the scheme. With each document, the case against Morrison and his associates became stronger and more undeniable. When Clara finished her presentation, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Tom Phillips stood up, his face flushed with anger. "I knew it," he said firmly. "I knew Jake Hartwell would never have risked his family's future through foolish borrowing. And I knew Buck Morrison was too quick to profit from his neighbor's misfortune." Others began to speak up, sharing their own suspicions and memories. A shopkeeper recalled Morrison paying cash for large purchases shortly after the Hartwell ranch was sold. A banker remembered irregularities in loan documents that he had been pressured to ignore. A ranch hand described being offered money to give false testimony about Jake Hartwell's business practices. "The question is," said Martha Phillips, "what do we do about it now? 23 years have passed. The people responsible are still here, still profiting from their crimes." Clara had been preparing for this question. "We expose the truth. We make sure everyone in the county knows what really happened, and we make sure that justice is finally served." "How?" asked Dr. Winters. "Morrison and his associates have had decades to cover their tracks, to establish themselves as respectable businessmen." Clara smiled, and for the first time in days, it was the expression of genuine satisfaction. "They've been respectable for so long, they've forgotten to be careful. And some of them have been making new enemies along the way." She had saved the best news for last. "This afternoon, I received a telegram from San Francisco. A private investigator I hired has been tracking Charles Jameson's business dealings. It turns out that the fraud against my family wasn't an isolated incident. Jameson has been involved in similar schemes in 3 other states, always working with local partners to acquire valuable land through manufactured debt." The room erupted in excited conversation. If Jameson could be proven to be a career criminal, it would lend credibility to Clara's accusations and potentially expose an entire network of fraud. "There's more," Clara continued. "Federal authorities are already investigating Jameson for mail fraud and conspiracy. If we can provide them with evidence of his activities here in Texas, it could be enough to bring down the entire conspiracy." As the meeting wound down, the group made plans for coordinated action. Dr. Winters would prepare a sworn statement about Jake Hartwell's final weeks and the suspicious circumstances of his death. The banker would review old records for evidence of document forgery. The ranch hands would gather testimonies from others who had witnessed Morrison's suspicious activities. Most importantly, they would present a united front in confronting Morrison and demanding that he answer for his crimes. Clara left the meeting feeling energized and hopeful for the first time since her return to Dry Creek. She was no longer alone in her fight for justice. The community that had been forced into silence by fear and intimidation was finally ready to speak the truth. But she also knew that Morrison and his associates wouldn't surrender without a fight. They had too much to lose, and desperate men were capable of desperate actions. The real confrontation was still to come. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Texas countryside, painting the Henderson Ranch, Clara's ranch now, in shades of gold and amber that reminded her why her father had loved this land so deeply. She stood on the porch of the main house, watching the sun rise over pastures that had been in dispute for over 2 decades, but were finally, legally, and rightfully hers again. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of activity. Word of the evidence against Buck Morrison had spread throughout the county with the speed that only genuine scandal could achieve. People who had harbored private doubts for years were finally speaking openly, and the carefully constructed narrative of Jake Hartwell's financial irresponsibility was crumbling under the weight of truth. Clara had spent those days organizing the evidence, coordinating with federal investigators, and preparing for what she knew would be a final confrontation. Morrison and his associates could no longer ignore the mounting accusations or dismiss them as the fantasies of a bitter woman seeking revenge. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of visitors. Clara watched as 3 riders approached, recognizing the distinctive figures of federal marshals. She had been expecting them, and their arrival meant that the investigation had reached a critical point. The lead marshal was a tall, weathered man named Robert Hayes, who had been tracking Charles Jameson's fraudulent activities across multiple states. He dismounted and tipped his hat to Clara with professional courtesy. "Miss Hartwell, we've reviewed the documents you provided, and they're exactly what we needed to complete our case against Jameson and his associates. The evidence shows a pattern of fraud spanning nearly 3 decades. "What about Morrison?" Clara asked. "We'll be arresting him this morning, along with 2 other local businessmen who were part of the conspiracy. The documentation you provided proves their involvement beyond any reasonable doubt." Clara felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served, but it had taken 23 years and couldn't restore her father's reputation during his lifetime. "There's one more thing," Marshal Hayes continued. "We'll need you to be present when we make the arrests. Your testimony will be crucial for establishing the full scope of the conspiracy." Clara nodded. She had known this moment would come, and despite her apprehension, she was ready to face the men who had destroyed her family. The arrest of Buck Morrison took place at his ranch, a sprawling property that had grown dramatically in size and value since the mysterious acquisition of the Hartwell land 23 years earlier. Clara rode with the marshals, accompanied by Tom Phillips and Dr. Winters as witnesses to the proceedings. Morrison was on his front porch when they arrived, apparently having been warned of their approach. His face was flushed with anger, and what Clara suspected was fear, though he tried to maintain his customary bluster. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded as the marshals dismounted. "You have no business on my property." "Not Buck Morrison," Marshal Hayes announced formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft. You have the right to remain silent." "This is ridiculous," Morrison snarled, his gaze fixed on Clara with undisguised hatred. "You're taking the word of this woman over a respected member of the community." "We're taking the word of documented evidence," the marshal replied calmly, producing the handcuffs. "Evidence that shows your involvement in an elaborate scheme to defraud the Hartwell family of their property." As Morrison was led away, he continued to shout accusations and denials, his voice growing more desperate with each word. But Clara noticed that his supporters, the men who had stood with him at the auction, were conspicuously absent. Word of the federal investigation had apparently convinced them to distance themselves from their former ally. The second arrest was even more dramatic. Charles Jameson was staying at the hotel in Dry Creek, apparently believing that his money and connections would protect him from serious consequences. When the marshals entered his suite, they found him attempting to burn documents in the fireplace. "Too late for that, Mr. Jameson," Marshal Hayes said, as his deputies secured the partially burned papers. "We already have everything we need." Jameson's polished composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with," he said, his voice shaking. "I have connections, resources. This won't stand." "Your connections didn't help you in Colorado or Kansas," the marshal replied. "And they won't help you here." Clara watched from the hotel lobby as Jameson was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit and manicured appearance suddenly looking shabby and desperate. The man who had tried to intimidate her with talk of serious money and professional competence was revealed as nothing more than a common criminal who had finally run out of places to hide. The third arrest was more subdued. Samuel Garrett, the banker who had facilitated the fraudulent loans, surrendered quietly when presented with the evidence of his involvement. His cooperation with the investigation would prove crucial in unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy. News of the arrests spread through Dry Creek like wildfire. By evening, a crowd had gathered at the courthouse for an impromptu community meeting to discuss the revelations and their implications for the county. Clara found herself at the center of attention, no longer the mysterious stranger who had shocked everyone at the auction, but a hometown daughter who had returned to seek justice for her family. The transformation in how people treated her was remarkable. Where there had been suspicion and mockery, there was now respect and admiration. "Miss Hartwell," called out the current mayor, a nervous man named Peterson who had clearly been worried about his own potential involvement in the scandal. "On behalf of the community, I want to apologize for the injustice your family suffered. If there's anything we can do to make amends..." Clara stood to address the crowd, feeling the weight of 23 years of exile and struggle. "The only amends I need are the ones we've already achieved, the truth being told and justice being served. My father's reputation has been restored, and our family's name has been cleared." She paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd, people she had known as a child, people who had been her father's friends and neighbors, people who had been forced into silence by fear and intimidation. "But I want you all to remember this," she continued. "Injustice thrives when good people remain silent. For 23 years, many of you knew that something was wrong with the official story about my family's downfall. You had doubts, suspicions, questions, but you stayed quiet because it was easier, because it was safer, because challenging powerful people seemed impossible." The crowd was silent now, absorbing the gentle but firm rebuke. "I don't say this to blame anyone," Clara added. "I understand the pressures you faced, the fear you felt, but I hope that when the next injustice occurs, and it will occur, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that truth has power, that ordinary people can make a difference, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." As the meeting wound down, people approached Clara individually to offer congratulations, apologies, and support. Many shared their own memories of her father, their private doubts about the official story, and their admiration for her persistence in seeking the truth. Dr. Winters was among the last to speak with her. "Your father would be proud," he said simply, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of the woman you've become. He always said you had the strongest will of anyone in the family." "He gave me something to fight for," Clara replied, "a name worth defending and a truth worth telling." As the crowd dispersed, Clara found herself standing alone in the courthouse square, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: running a ranch, rebuilding relationships, establishing herself as a permanent part of the community she had been forced to leave as a teenager. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, she felt truly at peace. Her father's name had been cleared, his reputation restored, and his killers brought to justice. The land that had been stolen from her family was hers again, free and clear of debt or dispute. Jake Henderson approached as she prepared to leave, his hat in his hands and a serious expression on his young face. "Miss Hartwell, I wanted to ask you about my position at the ranch. I know you'll want to make your own decisions about staff and operations." Clara smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, your grandfather kept faith with my family for over 20 years, preserving evidence that helped bring about justice. Your family has earned a permanent place at this ranch, for as long as you want it." Relief flooded the young man's face. "Thank you, Mom. I promise you won't regret it." "I know I won't," Clara replied. "We're going to rebuild this ranch together, make it everything my father dreamed it could be." As she rode back to her ranch under a star-filled Texas sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 23 years of hard work in San Francisco, building a business from nothing, saving every dollar she could spare, all in preparation for this opportunity. People would ask her in the years to come why she had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, to reclaim land in a small Texas town that most people had never heard of. The answer was simple: because it was hers. Because it represented her father's life work and her family's legacy. Because some things were worth fighting for, no matter how long the fight took or how much it cost. The Henderson Ranch, the Hartwell Ranch now, spread out before her in the moonlight. 8,000 acres of Texas soil that had been won, lost, and won again through determination, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of truth. Clara Hartwell was home at last, and this time she was home to stay. Epilogue. 5 years later. The annual cattle auction at the Hartwell Ranch had become one of the most important events in West Texas, drawing buyers from as far away as Kansas and New Mexico. Clara stood on the porch of the main house, watching the organized chaos of the auction proceedings with satisfaction and pride. The ranch had prospered beyond her wildest dreams. The combination of modern breeding techniques, improved land management, and good old-fashioned hard work had transformed the property into a showcase of successful ranching. But more than that, it had become a symbol of justice and perseverance that inspired people throughout the region. Buck Morrison had died in federal prison, never admitting to his crimes but no longer able to profit from them. Charles Jameson had been sentenced to 20 years for his involvement in fraudulent land schemes across 4 states. The other conspirators had received lesser sentences, but had lost their positions of influence and respect in the community. Clara had used her success to help other families who had been victims of similar fraud, establishing a foundation that provided legal assistance to people fighting to reclaim stolen property. The Clara Hartwell Foundation had already helped dozens of families across Texas and the Southwest, proving that her return to Dry Creek had been about more than personal vindication. As the afternoon auction concluded, Clara noticed a familiar figure approaching the house. Tom Phillips, now in his 70s but still vigorous, climbed the porch steps with a smile on his weathered face. "Another successful year," he observed, settling into one of the rocking chairs that Clara had added to the porch. "The best yet," Clara agreed, joining him in the adjacent chair. "Did you see the price that Bull brought? $12,000 for a single animal." "Your father would be amazed," Tom said. "He always knew this land had potential, but I don't think even he imagined it could be this productive." Clara looked out over the rolling pastures where her cattle grazed in the golden afternoon light. "He knew something that I had to learn the hard way, that the value of land isn't just in what it produces, but in what it represents. Family, legacy, the willingness to fight for what's right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the buyers load their purchases and begin the journey home. The success of the auction was gratifying, but Clara had learned that the real satisfaction came from knowing that her father's dream lived on, stronger than ever. "Any regrets?" Tom asked eventually. Clara considered the question seriously. About leaving San Francisco? About spending 23 years away from home? About the fight with Morrison and his associates? About any of it. Clara shook her head slowly. No regrets. Every day of struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, it all led to this. And this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. As the sun began to set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Clara Hartwell reflected on the journey that had brought her home. She had left as a frightened teenager, driven away by lies and fraud. She had returned as a successful businesswoman with the resources and determination to reclaim her birthright. But most importantly, she had proven that truth, no matter how long buried, had the power to triumph over injustice. Her father's name was honored throughout the region now, and the Hartwell Ranch stood as a monument to his memory and his values. The mockery and dismissal she had faced at that first auction seemed like a lifetime ago. The men who had laughed at her worn boots and questioned her right to be there had learned that appearances could be deceiving, that quiet determination could overcome loud bluster, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who changes everything. Clara Hartwell had bought more than land at that auction 5 years ago. She had bought justice, vindication, and the right to come home. And in the end, that had proven to be worth far more than the $1 million she had paid for it. The ranch was hers, the truth was known, and her father's legacy was secure. She'd kept her promise to both the living and the dead, and she would continue to keep it for as long as she drew breath on the Texas soil that had always been and would always be home.